Little Albert and His Silent World. The first time I saw him, we were both children. I was walking with my mother through one of Munich's wide, tree-lined streets. It was the beginning of autumn. The leaves hadn't fallen yet, but their colors had begun to change, yellow and orange tones shimmering softly in the morning sun. The air was cool and clean, the cobblestones beneath my feet slightly damp from the morning dew. My mother had brought me there to meet the neighbors, a small house with a garden, whitewashed walls, wooden window frames, 2 small potted flowers by the door. And there, in the farthest corner of the garden, sat a child, alone, not speaking to anyone. He had pulled his knees to his chest, sitting on the ground, staring at the small pieces of stone in front of him, with such deep concentration, as if those stones were whispering something to him. Everything around him seemed to have stopped. My mother said softly, "Go on, say hello." So I walked over slowly. Even the sound of my footsteps on the grass should have been enough for him to hear, but he didn't look up. "What are you doing?" I asked. He raised his head. Large, dark eyes, his hair a little messy. He looked at me for a long moment, as if he were considering the question. Then he turned back to the stones. Thinking. We didn't talk much more that day, but something had caught my attention. Most children at that age run, shout, push each other, laugh, cry. Albert, though, could sit for hours as if he had a whole other world inside him, needing nothing, just thinking. That didn't make him strange in my eyes. It just made him different. I later learned that Albert had been slow to start talking. His family had wondered about it, even worried for a time. But when Albert finally did begin to speak, he spoke in complete sentences, as if he hadn't wanted to bother with words at first, waiting patiently until he found the right ones. That was very typical of him. He never rushed anything, never left anything half-finished. Munich was a quiet city in those years. Grand squares, tree-lined streets, long walking paths along the river. In the mornings, the smell of bread from the bakeries would drift through the streets. By evening, everything would settle again, as if the city itself were breathing out. The Einstein family had found their place in that quiet rhythm. His father, Hermann, ran a small electrical company with his brother. His mother, Pauline, was devoted to music. The sound of the piano was never absent from their home. Sometimes you could hear it even from the street, spilling out through an open window. Perhaps that is why Albert loved music so deeply. The violin was not merely an instrument to him, it was a refuge. On difficult days, when his mind was full, after hours of wrestling with something he couldn't solve, he would turn to the violin. I saw this even years later. He would rise, move to the corner of the room, and begin to play, slowly. The notes hesitant at first, then gradually opening up. And I would sit quietly nearby and listen. That music, somehow, would calm all of that complexity. One of the things that struck me most in those childhood years was Albert's questions. They were not ordinary questions. Children ask things, don't they? Why is it like this? But Albert's questions went so much deeper. Once, we were sitting together in the park. We were maybe 8 or 9 years old. Autumn had come again. Leaves were falling silently around us, and Albert suddenly turned to me. "If you sat on top of light, what would you see?" I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" I said. "If you traveled at the speed of light, what would the world around you look like? I had no answer, because I had never thought of anything like that before. But Albert had, and he carried that question in his mind for years. Many years later, that childlike question turned out to be the very first seed of his greatest discovery. But what struck me most was the way little Albert was alone. He was not afraid of solitude. He seemed to use it like a tool for thinking, for imagining, for wandering through his own inner world. When I watched him, I sometimes thought, this child is carrying something inside him. One day, it will find its way out. And it did. But first, there was a longer, quieter road ahead. Chapter 2. School Years and the Silent Weight of Not Belonging. When Albert entered the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich, he had just turned 10. That school loved order. Everything had its place. Everything had its time. The corridors were clean and cold. Teachers spoke, students listened. Teachers asked, students answered. Everyone moved forward at the same pace. And Albert could never find his place in that rhythm. It wasn't a rebellion. He wasn't doing it to draw attention. It was simply that even inside that classroom, you could sense his mind was somewhere else entirely. While a teacher wrote on the board, Albert was probably looking out the window, watching the clouds, turning that light question over again in his head. Seeing him in the school corridors was a strange feeling. The other children would run at recess, shout, push each other. Albert would usually stand somewhere to the side, hands in his pockets, looking far away. He seemed alone, but he didn't seem troubled by it. When I joined him, I would sometimes walk over quietly and stand beside him. We didn't always talk. We would simply stand there, side by side. And that was enough. I had heard that one of his teachers once said something to him, in front of the whole class. Einstein, you will never amount to anything. When I found out, something tightened inside me. Because I knew Albert. I knew how he thought, what he carried. And I knew how words like that work their way into a child. Albert never mentioned that day to me. But in the weeks that followed, I noticed he had turned a little more inward. He spoke less, looked more. But one thing did not change. His curiosity. That never dimmed. Not once. In mathematics and physics, though, things were entirely different. There, Albert had a kind of peace. Numbers, equations, geometric forms. Getting lost inside an equation was, for him, like walking freely through a garden. I asked him about it once. Why does mathematics make you so happy? He thought for a long time, looked out the window, then turned back. Because if a rule exists, that rule holds everywhere. Not in one place, everywhere. That gives me a sense of security. I understood him. The rest of life was not so orderly. People were inconsistent. Rules changed. Promises were broken. But mathematics was not like that. That constancy was a kind of home for Albert. A place he could return to and always find the same. In that period, we spent most of our time together at the library, an old building in a quiet part of Munich. When you stepped inside, the smell of wooden shelves greeted you. Slightly damp but warm air. Shelf upon shelf of books. The light filtering through the windows would make dust particles visible in the afternoons. Everything there was slow and still. Albert would read for hours in that library, always in the farthest corner, as if wanting to separate himself just a little more from the rest of the world. I would sit beside him too, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting. The silence beside Albert was never heavy. It was restful. But the Munich years didn't last long. When his father's business began to fail, the family moved to Italy. Albert stayed behind to finish school, alone. 15 years old, in a school he didn't love, his family in another country. In the end, he could no longer bear it. He obtained a doctor's note, left school, and went to join his family. When I heard that, I thought to myself, good, because that school had nothing left to give Albert. But what Albert had to give the world had not yet begun.
Chapter 3: The Cool Air of Switzerland and a New Beginning. After spending some time with his family in Pavia, Albert decided to move to Switzerland. He applied to the Polytechnic in Zurich. The entrance exam was demanding, and Albert failed it the first time. When he told me about it later, there was neither anger nor bitterness in his voice, just quiet acceptance. My French wasn't good, he said. The math and physics sections were fine, but the others weren't. It wasn't an unfair result. That was one of his qualities. He was very honest with himself. He simply saw and accepted. The school director, however, had been impressed by Albert's performance in physics and mathematics. He recommended a cantonal school in Aarau. Albert studied there for a year, and that 1 year became one of the most beautiful periods of his life. Aarau was a small Swiss town surrounded by mountains, but the mountains didn't press down on it. They seemed to embrace it. Narrow cobblestone streets, fountains on the corners, always running clean and cold, a river flowing quietly nearby. In the mornings, mist would settle into the valley, and everything would be wrapped in soft light. In the afternoons, the mist would lift, and the mountains would reappear in the distance. Albert had said it to me himself, that for the first time in a classroom there, he had truly been able to breathe. I visited Albert during this period. When I arrived, it was mid-afternoon. I walked through the narrow streets, paused at a fountain, dipped my hand into the cold water for a moment. Then I went looking for him. I found him on a hill just outside the town. His notebooks were with him, but they were closed. He was sitting on the grass, knees drawn up, looking into the distance. The mountains stood there, large and still. "What are you thinking about?" I said, the same as always. He turned and smiled. He smiled rarely, but when he did, his whole face opened. Light. Still the same question, the one he had asked in the park as a child. Years had passed, cities had changed, but the question was the same, as if that question had been growing up alongside him. I sat down beside him. We didn't speak for a while, just sat and looked at the mountains. The wind blew softly, the grass stirred. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, just once. I love those moments, the ones that go unspoken, but are full. He was admitted to the Zurich Polytechnic in 1896, and there he met some of the most important people in his life. Marcel Grossmann was one of them. Organized, meticulous, someone who kept everything in its right place. He took careful notes, never missed a class, always submitted his work on time. Albert was the exact opposite. He would sometimes skip lectures, or wrestle alone with a question in his head. But Marcel was always there, and he always shared his notes with Albert, without complaint, without expectation. That friendship lasted for years. It was a real one. And in those years, another person entered his life. Mileva Maric. Mileva was the only female student in their department. Intelligent, quiet, and determined. Albert had first met her at a physics seminar. He told me about that day as we walked together once. When she started speaking, she was thinking far more sharply than I had expected. Between them, a slow and quiet closeness developed. They read books together, compared notes, fell into long discussions. Albert wrote her letters, long, thoughtful letters. I saw some of them. They contained physics, philosophy, the details of daily life, and in every line, you could see how Albert's mind worked. The Zurich years were a beautiful time for me as well. I remember walking along the lakeside with Albert. It was usually autumn evenings. Cool air, the lake still, a few boats in the distance. He would be thoughtful as he walked, his steps slow but deliberate, and I would be beside him, in silence. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. But either way, those moments were precious. Chapter 4. The Sky Seen Through the Patent Office Window. In 1902, Albert moved to Bern, and there he found work at the Swiss Federal Patent Office. Bern was different from Zurich, smaller, quieter, with an older feeling to it. The cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Walking through the arched passageways felt as though you were moving backward through time. Clock towers on every corner, ticking quietly, like the pulse of the city. Albert lived in a small apartment, little furniture, a table, a few chairs, a narrow bed, but many books, on the shelves, on the table, even on the floor. From the window, you could see the rooftops of the city, terracotta-colored roofs arranged one after another, a bell tower in the distance. Albert loved to look out of that window. "What do you see out there?" I once asked. He turned, thought for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "But sometimes you need to see nothing. When the mind rests, the things that truly matter rise to the surface." When I first heard that Albert was working at a patent office, it seemed strange to me. Albert Einstein, patent examiner, a man who carried the structure of the universe in his mind, sitting at an office desk reviewing invention applications. But knowing Albert as I did, I also knew he could think anywhere. He would arrive at 8 in the morning, finish his assigned work before anyone else, and with whatever time remained, he would quietly write in the notebook he kept in his desk drawer. I visited him once during his lunch break. We met in a small park nearby, sitting on a bench under the trees. Albert had brought a sandwich, but he didn't eat it. He opened his notebook and began to write. I sat quietly beside him. The wind gently stirred the leaves. Children's voices drifted over from somewhere. Sunlight drew a long, bright line across the bench. That was how that lunch break passed. In silence, but not in emptiness. It was a full silence. He married Mileva in 1903, a small ceremony with close friends and family. I was there. Albert seemed very calm that day, not anxious, not excited, just calm and ready, as if this too was simply a natural part of life. Their marriage was, in a way, two thinking people building a life together. They would discuss physics in the evenings. Albert would explain an idea. Mileva would raise an objection. This never bothered Albert. He welcomed objections.
because a good objection made a thought stronger. And in those years, something inside Albert was slowly ripening. The light question was still there, but now it was clearer, sharper. Sometimes he would begin to explain something, then stop mid-sentence and drift away inside himself. His gaze would travel somewhere distant. I would watch, wait quietly, then say his name softly. He would return, smile faintly. "Where were you?" I would ask. Far away. Looking out through that small window of the patent office, I think Albert was seeing more than just rooftops. He was looking at the fabric of the universe, and he didn't yet fully know what it was he was seeing, but he was close now, very close.
Chapter 5, 1905 and the Year of the Silent Revolution. In 1905, Albert was 26 years old, and that year, he wrote 4 papers that would change the world's understanding of physics forever. 4 papers in a single year. When I heard this, I was quiet for a while, because the man who had done this was still the same person sitting down at his desk in that small burned patent office every morning at 8. He had no academic position, no laboratory, no assistants, just his mind, a pen, and time. When he told the story himself, he said, "I had been carrying certain things for a very long time, as if water had been building up, and that year it found a way out." The first paper was on the photoelectric effect. It showed that light behaved not only as a wave, but also as a particle. A bold claim for its time. Almost no one believed it immediately. The second paper was on Brownian motion. It explained how small particles move through water, and it actually proved that atoms genuinely existed. In those years, the existence of the atom was still debated, extraordinary as that seems now. The third paper was the special theory of relativity, and inside that paper was the question he had asked as a child in the park. If you sat on top of light, what would you see? It was no longer just a question. It was a theory. It said that space and time were not fixed, but relative, that depending on a person's speed and position, time itself flowed differently. When he explained this to me, honestly, I couldn't fully grasp it, but I grasped something of it the way Albert explained it, because he had a way of making very complex things very simple. "Think about it," he said. "A train is moving very fast. For the person inside, 1 second passes. Someone watching from outside sees something different. Time is not the same for both of them. Each one is living in their own time." "How is that possible?" I said. "Because it is." And he smiled, that familiar smile. The fourth paper was perhaps the most famous of all. E equals mc squared. Mass and energy were 2 different expressions of the same thing. A small amount of mass could become an enormous amount of energy. 4 papers, 1 year, born from a notebook in a desk drawer. That year, I saw Albert a few times, and he hadn't changed. Still the same slow walk, the same untidy hair, the same thoughtful gaze. He didn't carry himself like someone who had upended the world's understanding of physics, because as far as he was concerned, these things had already been there. He had simply written down what he'd seen. "How have the papers been received?" I asked. He shrugged, with a calm, easy gesture. "Not many people have read them yet. We'll wait." One evening, we walked together through the streets of Bern.
Night had fallen. The street lamps had lit the city in a warm, yellow glow. The cobblestones were wet. It had just rained. Our footsteps struck the stones in a steady rhythm. Albert had his hands in his pockets. For a long time, we didn't speak at all. Then Albert lifted his head and looked up at the sky. Stars were visible through the clouds, here and there. "The same rules apply up there, too," he said. "The same equations. Everywhere." I said nothing. We just kept walking. Slowly, the world of science began to read those papers, began to understand. And the name Einstein, more and more people began to hear it. Chapter 6. Awards, Years, and the Quiet Echo of a Life. Fame did not come to Albert quickly. Perhaps that was for the best, because if it had come quickly, knowing him as I did, it might have overwhelmed him. In 1909, he received his first academic position at the University of Bern, then Zurich, then Prague, then back to Zurich. And in 1914, he was called to Berlin, one of the most prestigious centers of science in the world. And they wanted Albert. His life was changing, but one thing wasn't: the way he walked. Still those same slow, thoughtful steps. Still that same gaze. During the Berlin years, he completed the general theory of relativity. In the special theory, he had addressed time and space, but gravity was missing. This took a decade. He wrestled with the problem for years, sometimes filled with hope, other times certain he had reached a dead end. He once said to me, "Some problems take 10 years just to ask correctly." In 1915, he published the General Theory of Relativity, recognized as the greatest revolution in physics since Newton. Gravity was no longer a force. Massive objects bent space-time. Other objects moved through that curvature. The Earth flows through the space-time bent by the sun's mass, not pulled by a rope. I still remember the example he used. "Put a heavy ball in the middle of a blanket," he said. The blanket sinks. Now put a small marble near the edge. The marble rolls toward that dip. That is gravity. Simple, but there was something immense inside it. In 1919, a solar eclipse confirmed that his theory was correct. Light bent as it passed near massive objects, exactly as Albert had said. And from that day on, the world changed. In 1921, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics. But the prize was not for relativity. It was awarded for the photoelectric effect, for that very first paper. When I heard that, I smiled. And Albert smiled too. "Relativity is still controversial," he said, "but the photoelectric effect is certain, so that's what they gave it for." Albert never made anything more of it than that. In the years that followed, life became harder. The political atmosphere in Germany shifted. Anti-Semitism rose. Albert's work was disparaged. This wounded him deeply. His trust in people was shaken, and his bond with his country slowly broke apart. He left Germany in 1933. He never returned. He settled in Princeton, a small house, a small office, a quiet town, wide trees lining the campus paths. When snow came in winter, everything would go still. Albert loved that stillness. He still walked every morning to his office, slowly, sometimes stopping, thinking, then walking on again. The last time I saw him, he was old, his hair very white, but still untidy.
deep lines across his face. But the eyes were the same. Those large, dark, thoughtful eyes. They hadn't changed at all. We walked together in the park in Princeton. Autumn. Leaves on the ground, red and yellow, rustling softly under our feet. Light coming through the trees in thin lines. Our steps were slow. We had agreed without saying so that we were in no hurry. We sat down on a bench. Albert placed his hands on his knees and looked into the distance. "What are you thinking about?" I said, the same as always. He smiled. Still the same smile. His whole face opened up. "Unified field theory," he said. "I still haven't solved it." He had spent his whole life trying to unite all the forces of nature into a single theory. He left without having done it. But this didn't seem to sadden him. I could feel that. Because for Albert, the answer was never the most important thing. What mattered was asking the question, the curiosity, the looking. "Any regrets?" I asked quietly. He thought. A child was running somewhere in the park, laughing. Leaves drifted in the breeze. "No," he said. "I wanted to ask, and I asked. I wanted to see, and I saw. That is all." In 1955, at the age of 76, he passed away. And I thought of that small child in the corner of the garden, staring at stones. "Thinking," he had said. He always thought. He always asked. And he changed the world by never stopping. Sometimes now I sit in that park, beneath Princeton's falling leaves. The wind passes through. The leaves rustle. From somewhere far away, a bell sounds, softly. And I find myself thinking I can hear those slow footsteps, as if he is still thinking, still walking, still asking. If you sat on top of light, what would you see?